So, Trevor, I think we have to follow up our next episode with someone really interesting and exciting who really maybe can give us some insights onto like accelerating drug development.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex topic. I mean, it's a really important topic because it's ultimately about getting to patients as quickly as possible. But it's not as simple as just sort of pressing a button and going fast. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So we're going to have to make sure we get the right speaker for that, that's got that experience, that presence and understanding. And as luck would have it, I have someone in mind.
Awesome. You have a great network. Who is it?
It is Murray Abramson, who is the CDO at Ascidian right now. But I had the pleasure of working with Murray for a number of years when we were both in biotech together. And I think he would be great. And I think he would jump at the opportunity to spend some time with us. Welcome to Regulatory, the emerging C-suite leader.
This is a podcast where you will be able to hear real-life stories regarding first-in-human challenges, accelerated programs, and understanding what's important from the investor narrative. If you are a biotech CEO, an investor, or a regulatory executive, this podcast is for you.
So, Debra, I'm super excited today about the topic that we're doing. So the topic today, as you know, is navigating fast timelines with limited patient populations and the use of adaptive trial designs. And I'm really excited about the guest presenter that we have today. He is super knowledgeable in this area. He is also super passionate in this area. He is so passionate, he may adopt expressive dance just to get his point across because he is so passionate about this topic. Now, I think the best person to introduce this presenter is the presenter himself. I'm super excited. Murray, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor. As an aside, before I introduce myself, I do think I remember doing an interpretive dance once. One of my earlier jobs at Biogen, I was talking about bees and trying to communicate to my team. And I think I actually did that very crazy thing. But to introduce myself, I'm Murray Abramson. I'm a physician and internist, specialist in infectious diseases, and I have my master's in public health epidemiology. I worked in academia for my early part of my career, but about 25 years ago, I left Duke to join Merck, MSD Merck, where I worked for 12 and a half years, initially working in vaccines and anti-infectives, and ultimately then expanding my role beyond that space and got into global medical research operations. Left Merck to join Biogen, where I led for 9 years, medical research operations, global clinical operations. And that's where we met, Trevor, of course, during that period of time. And it's wonderful to catch up with you again. And then subsequently, I've done some jobs at smaller biotech companies, including a technology company called Tempest AI, where I was head of their clinical non-oncology clinical innovation.
So thank you, Murray. Shall we jump straight into the first question that we wanted to talk with you about?
Absolutely. Happy to do so.
So everyone naturally wants to accelerate programs because they're very much thinking about the patient is waiting, especially so in areas of high unmet need. But before you start determining whether your clinical program is right for acceleration, what do you think you need to have a fundamental understanding of first, be it about the patient, the product, or the disease, or maybe all three? But what are some of the things that you think about first?
The answer, of course, is all three, right? You have to have the right drug. And you have to know the population that you need to address. One of the things that I am very extraordinarily passionate about is this concept of the moral imperative. Depending on the drug and the disease, there is a moral imperative because if you have the opportunity to make a change in someone's life and there aren't alternative therapies that they can use, time is of the essence. And so I really believe in building a deep patient engagement connection to the community and to understanding the subject's perspective in this. I think this is an imperative because it not only builds morale for the team inside the company, but it also helps you build a better protocol and execute it more effectively. And then, of course, you need to have the right regulatory plan that kind of ties things together and allows you to do this. So there are so many different components to being able to accelerate a trial. And I've seen things go very well, and I've seen things in my career where things didn't go to plan. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing.
In an accelerated program, everything has to be on track. Everything has to be tracking to the same timeline, to the same objective. And you mentioned about things where it's gone wrong and where it's gone right. So from your experience, what are some of the key data pieces or understandings that we're missing in the situations where it maybe went wrong? And then can you give an example of, how things went really well and what was imperative or what was key to things going well in that situation?
So going wrong, things are they naturally go wrong if you don't correct it. We live in a universe of entropy. What goes wrong is that you build the protocol in a vacuum. What goes wrong is when you execute that, you don't connect to either the investigator or you tether too heavily to one or two investigators and not to a community. And you don't connect to the patient population to provide you feedback and input about insight and what you could do. I think what goes wrong is when you build your timelines and your trajectory, you're not building it based on prior experience and fact, but hope. And when you build your timelines based on hope, I think most of the time people are going to be extremely disappointed. So I feel that you have to find where there's a source of truth and where there's data to allow you to build your clinical plan, and it has to be built on a very strong foundation. And where you see problems, where you anticipate lack of input or lack of enthusiasm from the site or from the patient, where you have serious questions about the integrity of the protocol, be it scientific or compliance, you work those up very deeply upfront, because it's important to call out those problems proactively before they become a crisis. And you also then need to build a team that understands that the plan that you've put into place is both built in stone, because you want to meet those timelines based on those facts, but also have the flexibility that people need to blow the whistle or pull the string, whatever metaphor you use, that they can identify problems before they become crises. So often team members go into this plan once it's been established, thinking very easily that their small part is quite small and they can continue working when things go off track. And indeed, they have the opportunity and should be empowered to pull the switch and allow the rest of the team know that they're having trouble as soon as possible. So it's a team dynamic, but it's also building the right foundational plan up front that you're going to live by, and everybody is aligned with those goals and the objectives up front.
Mm-hmm. To kind of play off of that a little bit, how do you feel that regulatory helps you build that team and pull them together? And I think about things that, like recent news where drugs have not gotten approved or gotten complete response letters because the CMC, because of manufacturing, was not keeping up to track with the clinical development. What is your experience on that, and any thoughts or words of wisdom you can share on that?
I think it's I'm trying to put into the proper terminology of where we are right now in society, where things can switch so quickly. We all need stability, and we all need to be able to have good communications with the regulatory authorities so we know what to plan with. On the company side, they need that because they can work within the team to create where there are gaps and issues, so you can call up and have these dialogues with the regulatory authority. Obviously, you need a regulatory authority that's going to be stable and rational and data-based, but assuming that most regulatory authorities still are rational, stable and data-based. I think making sure that the program team that's working on this has a way to work with their regulatory team to ensure that the communication, especially in the early days, especially for smaller companies, happens to be there. I think where you have lesions or problems is when you have these big surprises that occur within the program team. They're not fully discussed among the members, whether it be CMC, for any purpose. And you're really caught by surprise once you've started to, set your in timelines where you expect it to be the case. It's really problematic. So I would say that the CMC conversations, the medical conversations, the regulatory conversations, they need to be dynamic and open and honest. They have to represent what really is going on. And then the team needs to be able to bring these issues up to the regulatory authorities as appropriate. And hopefully you have a partner there. And I've seen it where we have had partners, really great partnerships with regulatory authorities. And I've been in places where things have been a little bit more contentious. I think building that good relationship doesn't come naturally. It comes with an experienced team or regulatory team who maintains that good communications with whichever regulatory authority there is.
So maybe, Murray, I can double click a little bit more on the regulatory theme that you started to talk about. And before doing that, I think both Debra and I fully get the standing back, seeing the bigger picture, also trying to look at what could go wrong and thinking about that before that happens. So just sort of standing back and challenging yourself. I think when we just building on the regulatory side, how important do you believe it is to understand the regulatory environment that you're in right now? The landscape that exists and what the precedent may be in different disease areas and all the sort of precedent and use of trial design methodologies that may have been used?
Yeah, I think that goes in part and parcel as you build the early plan and build the trajectory of expectations. I think having an experienced regulatory mind be part of that conversation to shape the dialogue is an imperative. I think understanding precedent of what has happened before, but understanding the current environment and what has changed is also critically key. I think just having a glancing expectation or knowledge of regulatory is not going to make it in today's world. The diseases are complicated, the therapies are new, the issues of patient, the issues of manufacturing, the issues of safety have gotten much more complicated depending on the therapeutic areas we find ourselves. So there's no question that having a steady regulatory hand at the wheel is critically important as a part and parcel of the program team that's building this clinical development plan and the integrated development plan that comes from that.
So, when you think about acceleration and getting into the patients and how quickly we can get to the patients, the adaptive clinical trial design has become like the big thing. Everyone wants to do this. Everyone thinks that if I do an adaptive design, this is like sure way to accelerate the program and get it to patients faster. So in your experiences, is that true? Is it always the adaptive design is the fastest way and it fits for all situations, or should it be more judiciously approached?
Well, I would argue that it's like anything, it needs to be judiciously thought about. It's not a once, fit for all purposes. I've worked in the space of small molecule. I've worked in the space of antibodies. I've worked in the space of DNA, and I currently work in an innovative space where I'm the chief development officer at Ascidian Therapeutics. I really do think the therapeutic modality has a part into it. The clinical endpoints associated with the disease that you're looking to address has a large part of this. And also just the very nature of the disease and the trajectory of change of disease once treated or untreated, the natural history. So I don't think that there is a one-size-fit-all purpose to this at all. I actually think it's way more complicated. And again, this gets back into the early planning that needs to take place at the development team, program team, that can weigh these sorts of issues and topics. I do think that adaptive design has the opportunity to accelerate certain opportunities, certain development programs can create greater efficiencies in running through a clinical trial, but that's not a given. Again, depending on the disease, depending on the drug, depending on the population that you're looking at in the clinical endpoint.
So in the context of an adaptive design, a lot of times people are trying to integrate an accelerated approval and a surrogate endpoint or a surrogate biomarker that can predict that clinical benefit earlier than the traditional ones. Any thoughts or on those that aspect of an adaptive design and accelerated approval?
I think from that perspective, if you're so fortunate to have the biomarkers that allow you to have a surrogate marker, I think you're very fortunate. Trevor, you and I worked in diseases which had a reasonable biomarker. We worked in diseases which had no reasonable biomarker, but it was being developed. And you had the dialogue with the regulatory authorities of that biomarker while it's being developed. And there are diseases that still don't have a meaningful biomarker that still evades me, and it makes development very complicated. If you have such a marker, if you have a disease that progresses at a rate that allows for this to happen, and you have a biomarker, and you have a patient population that's accessible to this, these are conditions that would be very ripe for adaptive design. And I think if you don't, I remember years ago, one of my former bosses would go discuss at length about the need to have more biomarkers and the need for those biomarkers. I think having the right biomarker is critical, even if you can't use it in the label, even if you can't ultimately get it to be part of the disease discussion and with the regulatory authorities. Just having a signal that gives you an indication that you're moving in the right track or maybe moving in the right track is so critically important as part of your adaptive design.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've seen, just in the news recently, obviously, about just how difficult it is to tie a biomarker directly to being able to be relied on to predict a clinical outcome, a clinical benefit. And that part is very difficult to establish. So thank you for those.
It's tying the early changes that tie the biology to the drug. It's also being able to identify and correlate the functional benefit that one will get from this, the patient will have from this, the anatomic benefit. And depending on the disease and the therapeutic area, that can get very complicated very quickly. And we've seen drugs fail based on the lack of that. And we've also seen drugs, there are a couple drugs in my career that have been incredibly built because there was a biomarker, there was a clinical outcome, and the clinical imperative was there, the patient population was there, the regulatory authorities' enthusiasm was there that allowed for very rapid acceptance and progression. The two that come to mind in my career, I would say, would probably be when I joined Merck. It was just after Crixivan was approved, for HIV. And here you have a disease that a disease that was wreaking havoc on human life. You have a drug that was working in a totally new domain, and there was a real ability to collaborate and build something very different and unique at an extraordinarily fast clip, so this protease inhibitor could be approved. The other drug that I'm very proud, and they're all the drugs I've worked on I'm proud of, but some have really been incredibly life-changing. The other one's for spinal muscular atrophy. That was a drug that we were able to do some very creative, innovative things. The designs themselves are creative. The way we found the patients was innovative. The various changes to public health and the ability to find these individuals at birth was innovative. And the drug itself was revolutionary, and it saved kids in a way that would have been unimaginable beforehand. And so I think that each drug and each population is a little different. Some of the greatest disappointments for me would have to be within the space of ALS. a disease of great desperate need. The clinical endpoints have evolved over this time, but finding a drug with the right population and being able to affect them in a meaningful way has still eluded most researchers in that space. And has been personally a very great disappointment.
And clearly, Murray, there's still so much to do, and knowing you as I do, I can see the passion within you with regards to wanting to make a difference, which is the same for many of us, particularly in working in the rare disease patient population. Just double clicking a little bit on the reference to regulatory dialogue, and Debra, you referenced news and some of the struggles that people have in connecting biomarkers to predictability of response. If you stand back, I mean, how important do you see it, Murray, in that understanding of the regulatory landscape and expectations of expedited approval pathways, the designations in accelerated development? How do you view the role, the frequency, and the interpretation of regulatory dialogue?
First off, you need experience. You need to have experience both to ground the internal team and give them purpose and direction with the details to build that relationship with the regulatory authority. You need to be able to build the team's plan that gives you the opportunity and material to build that relationship so that you have meaningful data and meaningful issues to discuss with the regulatory agency. And then you have to have a regulatory agency that is receptive to having those conversations and the company that reciprocates that. And I've worked in situations where companies have been very open and willing to have those conversations. And I worked in companies where they've been a bit more independent, not willing to have those conversations until the very end. Over the 25 years, I think what works best is having that regulatory experience up front, building the plan up front, building those regulatory interactions in a meaningful way, and doing it as you're building your program. I think the days of waiting to the very end or putting too much risk in the front is not a possibility in today's world within rare disease and small companies. I also think that you have to be able to have open and honest conversations with the regulatory authorities about what you're doing, because indeed, most interactions that I've had historically, they do want you to succeed, they do want to be able to be supportive, and they do want to shape. You just need to have the right communication style and person who can handle that, that can help translate that and bring it back to the company.
Clearly it's about partnering and working with agencies, listening, taking advice, going forward with a clear position, and working in partnership, for a patient population that's in desperate need. And that's the way that to solve that is to work in partnership.
Exactly. It is that partnership. It is a common theme, common vision, both within the company and the dialogue you have with the regulatory agency. Because nobody wants to see people suffer with many of these terrible diseases. And there is a true desire to accelerate. I mean, I see this even today, a true desire in so many therapeutic areas to want to accelerate and alleviate people's pain as much as possible. And I think for that reason, it gives me a lot of hope to stay and do what I'm doing in the therapeutic areas that I'm working in.
So if we think about, acceleration, we've kind of geared more towards the U.S., but when we think about harmonizing, the global clinical study, and in that respect, particularly in the EU, you have to really think about the payer needs, right, and health, HTA assessments, those sort of things. So you're on an accelerated path, and you're trying to align patient needs, regulatory needs, and now payer needs comes in. How, in traditional drug development, that's challenging, but in an accelerated path, it's even more challenging. How, I really resonated with me when you started the podcast, the patient perspective and what matters to them, and how do we translate that into what will be compelling for payers so that they actually get the drug that gets approved. Any thoughts on this and how you've overcome or been able to get that kind of data that you need?
I want to answer your question directly, but there's no simple, straightforward way of saying it. If everyone, to create that compelling need, some diseases have it and they come naturally. Fortunately, in my career, I've been working more on those diseases than not. So if we talk about ALS or dementia, or we talk about blindness because of an inherited retinal disease or dystrophy, these are things that are moving very rapidly, and there's a burning platform because the therapies that currently exist aren't adequate. And I think when you work within that space, it's easier to tap into the patient angst, and it's easier to tap into what the patients want and need. And I will say that it's not a monolith. So I think in order to tap into that thoroughly, you really do need to treat the individual patient as just that, an individual person. And that within a disease area, you have a pretty diverse group of needs and desires. But fundamentally, many of these diseases, what comes out of that is a unifying request. If it's SMA, it's to have a child who goes through their developmental milestones. If it's dementia, it's to allow somebody to cognitively work within the world that they live with as long as possible. If it's ALS, it's to not only expand survival, which is important, but to do it with a quality that allows people to spend their time they want. I haven't worked in oncology, but that natural imperative feels quite natural there too. And then when you look at issues such as, inherited retinal dystrophies, you're looking at people retaining their vision, being able to function, and things that are very small. So I do think that being able to have that deeper understanding with the patient group on an individual basis, not only through patient advocacy, but through multiple different venues, allows you to better identify your endpoints in a meaningful way. The reason why I go this long route around is because really you're having to ultimately connect human needs and financial costs to the equation. And historically, physicians have done that pretty poorly in the United States. We've been able to spend great deals of money on some things and not on others that may have great opportunity. And so when there's an economic connection with the public health need, I think having that dialogue with the European agency is critically important in designing what sort of economic trials you can create that meet that need. Some will do it better than others, but I think we have to be very honest with what these needs are, and have that dialogue with them. I also think you have to start doing those studies early, up front, because if you have any hope to attach it to your approval, that work has to be done pretty early and soon. I gave a very roundabout answer to a very simple question, but I warned you there was not going to be a simple answer to that question.
I actually don't think there is a simple answer, and I'm not sure I did ask a very simple question. Certainly people have been talking about the cost of goods for advanced therapies and, how exorbitant they are, right? So there's no simple answer to that question either about how we control those costs.
Yeah, and how long is, you can get philosophical very fast, right? You can start talking about what's the value of human life, what's the value of a human to see or a human to move and a human to think. And it depends on who you're asking. If you're asking the individual with limitless resources, you may get a different answer than a society who's trying to balance multiple medical needs and to be able to provide for the greatest good. So there are so many things. That's one of the reasons why I tend not to do those studies. I actually prefer to stay within the early to late space and not do the economic studies as some of my colleagues have done over the years.
Yeah, and as in terms of those types of studies, those endpoints are moving into registrational studies now in an accelerated program.
They are. So, and they definitely have been over the past few years. And it is a very challenging space. It challenges it challenges my mind to wrap around them sometimes. They're absolutely critical and needed.
So Murray, to pick up on your point, clearly this is not straightforward, and
nothing we do is straightforward.
Absolutely not. But that's because there's so many things that have to be taken into consideration as you try to do the best for patients that are in desperate need of new treatments. And I think sometimes that being conscious that the patients are waiting can drive this need for speed and this focus on speed. And sometimes, it's and I'm kind of intrigued whether you have experiences of balancing that desire for speed whilst also ensuring that you're keeping sight of what the ultimate approval will look like, and by default, how meaningful will that be for patients when you do make that new treatment available?
I will address that question through a bit of an anecdote. There was a time when I was running a monthly town hall with individuals who had ALS. And one thing that I always learned a lot from my interactions, I was there I was a partner with the other person who was conducting this town hall with me. And I was there kind of the medical part of the arm. And one thing I realized is that what people hope and dream of isn't the same. And it most definitely isn't the same as what the drug company is thinking. I believe in my heart that the drug companies that I've worked for, and most drug companies for that matter, really want to do the right thing. And how do you build that sort of desire and that passion while working within the framework of science, working with the framework of good clinical design and compliance, working within the good clinical design of ensuring the most significant and positive regulatory reception? There's so many different balances and there's so many different conflicts within that process. You're never going to create a clinical program that's going to, be perfect in every sort of topic. I think for me, what I've recognized, and time is always one of it, because time and money run hand in hand. What I've experienced, though, is that you can't do anything just for the sake of time, because it will always bite you at the end. You think you're moving fast right now, and you did not consider the issues of compliance and the audits that would come later. You were running really fast, but you didn't realize the issues of scientific integrity and the very design that might have taken a little bit more time. You didn't reconsider the issues of the logistic issues of making sure your investigational product was sent with the right regulatory acceptances and compliances. It is such an incredibly complicated system that we create in trying to get a drug approved that, honestly, it is amazing that we get anything approved, because if you just think about it and the years and the money that goes into it, it's really a daunting task. I've based my career on time, however. I'm trying to defy the ability to enroll study faster than it's ever been enrolled before. For me, it's never been predicated on the money. It's always been predicated on meeting the medical need. That's what drives me. But in order to do that successfully, you actually have to have a successful end. And for me, that means making sure you do build those regulatory connections, making sure that you have built compliance and quality within what you're doing, to make sure that you have the scientific integrity, to make sure you build the relationship with the patient engagement as well as the site engagement for a successful clinical trial. And I have to say, it's not a surprise that it does take many years to go through this, because even if you've done it multiple times, every time is a learning experience, because every disease and every condition is a little different. Every drug is a little different. I totally get the idea of getting pressure from executives to move faster. But if you do move faster, it does have to have all of those other compartments, all of those other topics to be addressed.
Yeah.
I'm waxing a little philosophic now. You'll have to forgive me, Trevor.
No, I think that is excellent. I think in terms of balancing that sort of need for speed and the need of the patient, what's really important is the planning that you had mentioned earlier about having the regulatory plan, making sure that everyone understands the truth about whatever inflection point you're at in the course of your development. And really being able to, if you understand that truth and you know the risks around it, then that can help shorten the timeline. Right? It can help.
It's being clear-eyed in the beginning. It goes back to what I said earlier, and that is you have a version of the truth based on as much experience and data that you can bring to the table. You create an environment at the table that is free to question one another in a constructive, positive way. And you build the various components of what this program design should look like up front. And you build expectations and you hold people hand to the fire to make sure that we are clear about the time, the cost, the structure, the support that you need. And that has to happen up front. But then also being honest, intellectually honest enough that when you do hit a bump in the road or you identify that you're coming to a bump in the road, that you have a fair and honest conversation of how to navigate that, clear-eyed. Because, again, surprises happen all the time. It's not that you expect the program to run smoothly without any issue. Fundamentally, it's how you deal with those problems as you're getting there. And I think every program I've had has had kind of a crisis at one point or another, and it's navigating through that crisis that makes your program successful or not. I think to your point, having that up front and designing that is really very important. But being honest with the team, having an open dialogue and being able to navigate in real time and be comfortable with that and not be so dogmatic or inflexible to what you've created, to me is a real part and parcel of being successful.
I think, Murray, as you referenced, drug development is unpredictable. And it can seem even more unpredictable when you're working at speed, and the importance of keeping that source of truth with regards to what is it that matters to the patient. How are you going to develop a meaningful new treatment, and working in partnership with the regulators so that you're able to move that program forward and generate the data so that it's clear that you are addressing an unmet need.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes up front, is having a drug that scientifically brings something to the table, addressing it in a disease that desperately needs it, having a way to connect the practical issues and the patient issues in a meaningful way. These are things that rare disease studies do all the time. And I think successful ones have the right compound and successfully create the right scientific questions, but also have the right dialogues with the regulatory authorities and the right patient engagement models that allow you to get there. And I think that's part of the fun and the excitement of working in this space, but it's also not for the faint of heart. And there are many days that it's a bit like being on a roller coaster. You're exhilarated, sometimes just as you're kind of brought down because of the issues and problems that you're having to confront.
Yeah,
Strap yourself in and do the seatbelt up.
Yeah, get a seatbelt and a very one of those bars. Actually, a seatbelt just wouldn't do. You need one of those safety bars.
So, Murray, thank you so much for taking the time. It's very clear your passion, your commitment, and your experience, with regards to how you want to make a difference. And it's clear you're not done. You've got so much more that you want to give. And, and I think that passion and credibility comes across so clearly. And thank you for sharing that experience. Debra and I do get requests after podcasts. And should we get a request for a reenactment of the Dance of 1,000 Bees? would you necessarily respond to that demand?
Probably not. You know,
Okay.
I don't think anyone thankfully photographed or videoed that event. It was at a time when I was actually bringing up bees in my backyard, and I was intrigued by the science and how they communicated. And I was trying to show my team that we needed to communicate better. So I think that performance was probably a one-time only event and probably couldn't be repeated.
Let's see what the demand is, Murray.
Let's see what the demand is. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
Thank you very much, Murray, for sharing your insights. It was a very delightful conversation. We really appreciate it. So I think, what I took away from this interview with Murray was very similar to what we heard in the first and second podcasts, is that it's very important to understand your risks and to know the truth and to be able to operate in the gray zone. And in order to do all of that, you need to have an integrated development plan in which regulatory plays a very important role.
Yeah, I mean, I think just picking up on a couple of points, and I think you're spot on, Deborah. I think, knowing the truth, reapprising yourself of the truth, recognizing that drug development is unpredictable, and understanding why that may have happened is really important. And often that does put you in a grey area where you're needing to stand back and look at, well, where do we go from here? And again, I think that is really important with regards to that relationship that you form with regulators, and looking at regulators as being partners in working together with regards to how can you get this treatment as quickly as possible to patients that are in desperate need. And I think that desperate need creates a real sense of urgency, but also with that sense of urgency becomes that responsibility to be able to step back and hold yourself to account to say, are we still doing the right thing? Are we still going in the right direction? Speed alone will do a disservice. But it's understandable with regards to why people are just sort of focusing on that need for speed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important about aligning those regulatory milestones. Accelerated approval and expedited development doesn't just mean getting a fast track, getting an RMAT, getting a breakthrough. That's not what it means. It means integrating and understanding when and where those interactions bring you value to help you accelerate that. And as we heard, an adaptive design can be really good, but it's not fit for all. And you really have to be judicious in when you want to approach using that in terms of accelerating and potentially getting an accelerated approval.
Yeah, and I think it's not just about getting the designation. It's about truly embracing the spirit of what that designation means and really using that to work and partner. I think sometimes it's very easy to get caught with, we must have this tagline, but it's ensuring you truly use that forum to really be able to have the conversations that matter, that ultimately serve you the purpose of getting there as quickly as possible.
I think one of the points that Murray mentioned was about, it's all fine and well and good to get your clinical trial up and running, but and to meet regulatory milestones that allow you to get it up and running. But if you can't understand what your true enrollment is going to be like in your clinical trial because you haven't interacted with the patient population or really understood what's important to them in a clinical trial such that they're not really willing to enroll in that kind of clinical trial, is really important. Having a study up and running and you can't get the enrollment that you need, that doesn't accelerate things. So you really have to build that and understand that truth and what are the risks to enrollment in your clinical trial if you really want to stay on that accelerated path.
Yeah, and I think, you raise an important point. Sometimes you can be so focused on enrollment and numbers and metrics, and for whatever reason, those numbers aren't being met, and rather than the numbers are wrong, that's an opportunity to challenge yourself and say, have we identified the right patient? Are we missing something? What else is there here with regards to how we move forward? And again, it keeps coming back to that searching for the source of truth. Sometimes it's not as obvious as you necessarily think it is, and you get blinded by data and time, and you need to move forward as quickly as possible, where really you need that check and balance where you're stepping back. So Deborah, we've done 3 podcasts so far, and 3 podcasts, 3 really important topics. The next topic we're going to do, I don't think is any less important. It's just as important, and when we think about, sort of getting the right patient cohort identified, getting the right study, working with regulators to get study approval, all of that is meaningless if you haven't made the right investment in the dosage form that you're going to be using and how the dosage form will develop with time. And invariably, you may not necessarily be using the exact same formulation in the same studies. And how do you bridge? How do you grow? I mean, thinking about this is another topic. I mean, there is so much that needs to be covered here, but it's so important. And we've got to really pull it out of the bag with regards to how we think about, getting another guest that can really help the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's more than just understanding where you are in your manufacturing and your quality aspects of the drug product itself. But what happens when things change? How do you adapt? How do you adapt, from a regulatory perspective, from a clinical perspective, from a non-clinical perspective? What does it change in any sort of manufacturing or scale up, which is really important for like advanced therapies, where you're starting with a drug that may have been manufactured in an academic or university hospital lab, basically, or manufacturing facility, and then you're scaling up to commercial. How do you adapt for that? You see so many clinical trials or applications for approval, and they get a complete response letter, and there are CMC related or manufacturing related issues there. How can those be avoided? And I'd love to be able to see if we could get someone who could really, address kind of this issue from the manufacturing perspective, but also from adapting to it in terms of the clinical, where you are clinically, as you alluded to.
So, Debra, we've just talked ourselves up in as much as this is a very complex topic. But worry not, I have an idea.
Aha! Can't wait to hear what it is.
Stay tuned.